Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Mr. Stephen. Now, the first witness today.
Yes, my lord, the first witness giving evidence today is Elaine Wilson of the Corra Foundation.
Good morning, Miss Wilson.
Good morning, my lord.
Right, when you're ready, Mr. Stephen.
I'm obliged, my lord. Good morning.
Morning.
Could I ask by starting with you to confirm your full name, please?
Elaine Wilson.
Thank you. Now, the Corra Foundation has provided a written response to a relate request made by this inquiry, and for the record, the reference for that is SCI-COR-XXX-4084. Just to reiterate that everything that's said in that relate document and everything else that's been provided will be taken into account, even if we don't touch on every single aspect of it in your oral evidence today. And just a gentle reminder that the hearing is being transcribed by stenographers, so please do try and speak slowly and carefully, and I'll do the same. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, you're here today to give evidence on behalf of the Corra Foundation, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Could you confirm your role there now and during the pandemic, please?
So I'm Head of Learning and Development, and I was Head of Learning and Development during the pandemic as well.
Thank you. And what does that role entail in brief terms?
That role kind of covers the helping Corra understand the impact of its work, so looking at are we progressing towards our strategy, helping the board understand the measures to help us progress that. And we also look at identifying and learning from the way we work and how we work to help improve our practices and share that learning for the wider benefit of the third sector.
Thank you. Could you also provide an overview of the key role or aims of the Corra Foundation, please?
Yeah, so Corra is an independent charitable foundation. We were established in 1985, previously known as Lloyds TSP Foundation for Scotland. Our main aim is to help communities and people across Scotland flourish, and particularly people who have faced inequity or barriers. We do that through a number of routes, predominantly grant making, so we distribute grants to third sector organisations with our own funds. Our trustees have an endowed fund, but also we partner with others, including the Scottish Government and other independent funders to distribute monies. We also work in 8 localities across Scotland where communities have traditionally not been able to access funding, and we work alongside them to identify opportunities to support them.
Thank you. You mentioned, I think, the third sector there and working together with the third sector. Just to be clear, what entities or groups do you mean by that when you're talking about working with the third sector in Scotland?
So when we talk about third sector, we talk about community groups, voluntary groups, social enterprises, charities that are registered with OSCAR, the Office of Charity Regulators, so a wide variety of groups. They can be really small, so with unconstituted, so just a few people coming together in their local community to make action, to large national and UK-wide charities.
Okay, thank you. I think I mentioned you say that it was an endowed fund that was the source of your funding as an independent grant-making foundation, is that right?
Yes. So the trustees have endowed funds which they set a strategy against and identify opportunities to distribute that money, which in the region is between £1 to £2 million per annum they distribute.
Thank you. Now, in the relate response provided by Corra at page 2, it says that Corra works alongside communities that traditionally funders do not reach. Could you give an example or examples of what communities Corra means by that, please?
So we are looking at communities of the size about 2,500 people, so small areas where people have kind of defined their own community. So it's not like a structural boundary. They've defined it by who they connect with, maybe around a central hub like a community centre or a library or a school. And what we do is we have appointed a coordinator, so someone that works alongside the community to identify the kind of things they want to see happen in their area things that would make a difference. And what we've done is given small sums of money to enable things just to take place without having to go through the burden of applying to an independent trust or foundation. And these can be anything from setting up walking groups to coffee mornings to, establish more food share opportunities that have evolved from those work.
And those are community coordinators that you're talking about?
Yes, community coordinators that are employed by Corra, and they're based in those localities. There's 8 localities. Most of them are in the west coast of Scotland and a couple in Fife.
And what's the benefit or benefits of having those community coordinators on the ground, I suppose? So
for us, as I said, we'd identified for several years that these were communities and areas that traditionally hadn't come forward or applied for funding from organisations like Corra. So we felt that there was something missing, and we went, how can we actually reach them and enable those groups to access funding and support, increasing more equity. We felt that having someone on the ground that could walk alongside people, that could just chat to them about things, about what mattered most to them, was a good way to do that and would benefit and engage the communities. We also thought it would maybe help them to identify opportunities for them to become established, like set up their own voluntary organisations or charities that then in turn would maybe then enable them to access more funding that would benefit the wider community, really helping them with a lot of the focuses on well-being, helping people make social connections, helping people respond to the needs around food, as I say, just reducing isolation and increasing confidence within the communities was the main purpose.
Thank you. And prior to the pandemic, in terms of funding recipients from the Corra Foundation, were there particular criteria or eligibility that Corra would apply? Yes.
So, as I said, we had our own funds and we had set criteria which often was focused on organisations that were charities, so that's those organisations registered by Oscar. We also would administer funds on behalf of others. Some of those funds were with Scottish Government, and again they would have set criteria that meant that people had to meet those conditions to enable them to access funding and support. Those applications that we received were then reviewed, and they would, against the criteria, and decisions were made on funding.
Thank you. And you mentioned the community coordinator role. Is that reflective of Corra's place-based approach? Again, that's something that's mentioned in your Rule 8 response.
Yes, that was part of our strategy in 2016, was to launch the kind of community coordinator role as part of our approach. Our place-based approach which was a 10-year commitment our Board of Trustees made to really getting alongside communities and understanding their needs and reducing barriers to funding.
And I think it's the People in Place programme, was that also
correct.
Part of that same?
Yes, the People in Place programme is the overarching programme, and as I said, the coordinators are part of that work.
Thank you. You've talked about the distribution of Corra's own funds prior to the pandemic. Was Corra also distributing funds on behalf of the Scottish Government prior to the pandemic?
Yes, we did. So we administered, there was probably 2 main funding programmes that we administered on behalf of the Scottish Government. The National Drugs Mission, which actually came in 2020, which is about £50 million, and then the Children, Young People, Early Intervention, Families, Adult Empowerment and Communities Fund. It's quite a long title. Yes, so we administered that fund, and that was a fund that was predominantly to children, families, charities, providing them core funding support, which we delivered from the Scottish Government.
And would that be through the form of a contract, or what would be the arrangement?
It was a formal contract, so we tendered for that piece of work and were successful in delivering it, and that's against a contract. And then that contract, we distribute the funds, make payments to those organisations, and we also provide networking events for those organisations to come together and a conference for those organisations to learn from each other as well.
Thank you. And in terms of the approach of Corra to funding prior to the pandemic, would there be a lengthy planning phase or thinking around what that would be, or?
Yes. So prior to the pandemic, it would be likely that we would take quite a while to think about criteria. So you would maybe spend 6 months to a year thinking about the criteria, making sure it was right, trying to respond to the different groups of people that you're trying to support through that. You would then spend a considerable amount of time looking at the application materials, like the application form that people would have to complete, and particularly if you were doing that in partnership with Scottish Government, there would be a lot of negotiation and going back and forth about the content of those forms and that information. And then you would also have to think about the timing for getting that launched, also thinking about the timing for people to complete that application process, and then the decision-making process. So it can take quite a lengthy time, and also from an applicant putting an application form in to a decision, it could be anything between 3 months and 6 months in that decision period.
Thank you. And just in terms of the volume of work that Corra would be dealing with pre-pandemic, can you give an indication to the inquiry of the number of applications or that were being dealt with previously? So
prior to the pandemic, we're probably talking about between 150 to 250 applications per year.
Okay. Thank you. If I ask you then, moving to the pandemic, the really written response that Corra's provided very helpfully sets out, I think, the two main strands of work that was being done at that time. I think firstly the distribution of your own funds, but secondly the distribution of Scottish Government emergency and recovery funds. I'd like to take...
Excuse me.
No, you're fine. I'd like to take each of those in turn, please, if I can. Starting with the distribution of Corra's own funds. I think you spoke of funding registered charities. I think you mentioned the Scottish Charity Regulator earlier on, that being the criteria that would be applied by Corra prior to the pandemic. Did that attitude or approach to funding change when the pandemic arrived?
So it had already probably just started to change. Corra launched a new strategy in about 10 days before pandemic hit. So in early March 2020, Corra had launched a new strategy. We were starting to shift to not only funding charities, but also funding constituted groups and community interests. So we had started to shift, but we hadn't really done a lot of work in that space. We had taken a lot of our learning from our place-based approach to go, there's lots of other third sector organisations out there we're not reaching and we could reach, but we hadn't done a lot, but we'd just started.
And was that a more stringent or generous approach to funding during the pandemic? Or?
I think it was more a generous approach to funding, so we recognised that we wanted to try and reach more groups and put more support out there to them, and so we had to be a bit more generous in our approach and also thinking about criteria to make it more accessible for those kind of organisations to apply and access funding.
You mentioned criteria. Are there any other examples of requirements that were lessened or it changed as a result?
Just because of Corra, or just on...
Yes, just in the distribution of your own funds, yes.
I think what else we did was we offered top-up grants to organisations that were already existing grant holders. So that didn't mean that they had to put any applications in or anything like that. We just wrote to existing grant holders and said, would you benefit from a top-up grant to support you during this difficult phase? And they just had to write back and confirm that. And if they said that was okay, we would then release the money without any additional requirements for them.
Okay. And in terms of reporting requirements during the pandemic in relation to your own funds, did that change from how it had been dealt with before?
Yes, we lessened our reporting requirements, so we recognised that many groups were either having to suspend a lot of their services, or they were having to take on a lot more work because of the nature of their support to communities and people across Scotland. So we kind of wrote to everybody again saying, look, there's a bit of flexibility in reporting. If you need more time, that's fine. If you want to just leave it for another 6 months, that's fine. So it was very much tailored to their individual needs, and they just got back in touch with myself or colleagues to chat that through, and we would just mark it. So it was very much making it as easy and fair as possible, and we made statements available on our website as well so that people knew that there was that flexibility there for them.
Thank you. And given that change, I think, of eligibility criteria, did you find Corra was working with new groups, perhaps, that you hadn't dealt with in the past?
Yes, I think we'd started to engage with new groups and new organisations that maybe hadn't been in touch or knew about Corra before. So we were learning from them as well about the kind of the barriers they were facing and what we needed to do to help them.
And were there any particular examples or of groups you would mention?
I think during that time, as I said, Corra started to work more with organisations who had traditionally not received funding from us. We started to work more with organisations that were led by people who had shared heritage or culture, so like people from Black, Asian, minority, ethnic community groups who maybe hadn't applied before. So I knew some of those organisations were starting to apply to Corra through some of these reduced restrictions that we had.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you now about the distribution by Corra of Scottish Government funding, please. Was it the Scottish Government that approached Corra to do this in the first instance?
So there's probably a mix of things in there. So initially with some of the funds, what we did, we were approached by organisations and partners that we knew well in the sector. So I think it was for the Third Sector Resilience Fund, Social Investment Scotland approached Corra and said, Scottish Government's really keen to distribute this fund around, but we know we don't have the capacity to do it, and we're looking to work we're looking for a partner who will come on board to help do some of the distribution, who's got the systems and structures in place to do that, and it's a programme with another partner, Firstport. Would you be interested in doing that? It's quite a quick turnaround, and we said yes, we'd be happy to do that. But in other instances, Corra, Scottish Government did approach Corra directly and said, would you be able to help us administer that? So there was quite a mix of different routes to those kind of funds and how they were set up and structured.
And you mentioned that mix. Was there therefore a mix in terms of Corra's role and what you were being asked to do in respect of different funds?
Yes, so there was a mix. So I think across all the funds, I think what was really evident from all the partners was the willingness to co-design the kind of criteria, a willingness to co-design the materials. So that was really collective, but then different roles came into play about whether you would be more taking the lead in terms of doing the sort of grant distribution, so getting the money out the door, or you might be more about just doing some of the assessments, so looking at the applications to make sure they were eligible and they could access the funding, or it might be you would take on more of a role of reporting. And that was often dependent on skill set or volume or a mix of both, so it varied.
Thank you. And we'll come on to this later, but I think you also say in the Relate response that you would work with officials of the Scottish Government and your partners, I think, to learn or improve the way that grant-making approaches or processes were carried out at that time.
Yes, I mean, they were kind of daily calls to start with partners to look at the materials that were being produced. Was there things that could be improved? What was the kind of feedback we were getting? Looking at volumes of applications that were coming in, where they were coming from. So we would look at that on a daily basis to try and adapt, taking a record of the kind of key points that we would maybe want to reflect in any future iterations of funds that might come down.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask about the role of intermediaries, because that's something else that's mentioned in your Relate. Could you explain what the role, well, first of all, who those intermediaries were, I suppose, but also what their role was in this distribution of funding?
So I think one of the key intermediaries was the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations. So SCVO, as it's known, is a kind of membership organisation that's there to support third sector organisations. So they provide a lot of advice and guidance around governance, around accounting, around HR structures, things like that. They also have a network that promotes funding opportunities and highlights funding opportunities to the sector. And SVVO was obviously very critical in both bringing to funders an understanding of what the third sector were saying to them and their members were saying to them about their needs, but also saying, look, we can maybe try and use our infrastructure and our skills to help support the development of a fund that funding opportunities that would really get out to the sector quite quickly and responsive. So that's the main partner that we dealt with. There's obviously There's other intermediaries, third sector interfaces, which take on a similar role as SCVO, but they do it in a very much localised context, so working at a local authority level or multiple local authority levels, where they'll engage with their members of the third sector to understand their needs and support. And they had quite a good understanding of on the ground in that local area what was happening in terms of the needs of charities, community organisations, constituted groups, etc.
So it'll be a collaborative effort, it sounds,
yes.
from what you're saying.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask you then about the change perhaps in workload or volume of applications that Corra was dealing with? You're obviously distributing your own funds, you're assisting with the distribution of Scottish Government funds during the pandemic, and you mentioned earlier what the volume was prior to the pandemic. How did that change as a result of what you were doing?
So I think it was evident from the first fund that we set up, which was the Third Sector Resilience Fund. This was one of the first ones to the sector the Scottish Government put money into, and it was launched within maybe a couple of weeks after lockdown. As I said, we went from about 250 applications a year to probably 250 applications in a week. So it was high demand. We also had set out that we would get the money out to organisations within 10 working days. So as I said before, we were like maybe 3 to 6 months in a decision phase. We were now moving to 10 working days, and that was money out the door, not just decisions, so payments made. I think we had, because of our skill set and our knowledge, we had worked quite a lot with the smaller groups. So we were working with organisations that had less than £100,000. So that's where the majority of the third sector is in Scotland. So we would see a higher volume of those applications. So it was a big shift for us. And I think we had to, our whole staff team were kind of working on supporting this. And we also brought in additional people to help provide support. Consultants and people that had worked for us in the past who had maybe early retired and come back just to support us to get some of this work done.
You read my mind, because you mentioned staff, and that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, because you've mentioned both the pace and I think the volume of work that Corra was dealing with, and I was going to ask you about the impact on the organisation if that was something that Corra was able to cope with. As I say,
we kind of took on different roles. So I went back to doing some grant making. I'd done grant making in the past, so I went back to doing some of the supporting around that grant making. We brought in a lot of our administrators helped with the sort of more payment side of things, so helping our finance team around some of that, processing those things. I say we did have. There's a few consultants that we have strong working relationships with that came in and provided additional support and resource to help us do that. But I think the key thing for us was we had to think about how do we actually review and assess the applications in a way that is able to get the responses out quicker. So that meant we had to shift our processes quite a bit to manage the volume as well as the number of staff that were working on it.
Thank you. To ask about the role of community, you talked earlier about the role of community coordinators. Can I ask what significance, if any, Corra's existing relationships and networks, what significance that had for you were then dealing with funding in the pandemic context? So
I think for our role of our community coordinators, I think what they did, they provided a bit more of support, so they helped with some of the assessing as well, but they also had networks and relationships with community groups in their local areas and really strong relationships with local authorities, so they were able to help network and connect people to provide and support in those local areas. They were also able to highlight lots of local groups and organisations in their communities that might be eligible for some of these funds and promote them to come forward and try and access some of those monies as well.
Thank you. In the written Rule 8 response at page 8, it talks about a targeted approach, I think, using partners' community knowledge and networks, and specifically mentions community anchor organisations. Could you please explain to the inquiry what those organisations are and what their role was, please?
So this fund was particularly set up by the Scottish Government and a number of partners, including like Highland and Island Enterprise and Southern Enterprise. And what it was identifying that a lot of communities were responding really quickly to the pandemic. So people were helping their community, whether that was distributing food or getting prescriptions to their neighbours, doing lots of things like that. And so what the Community Anchor organisation was, they were organisations either a local charity or, as I say, a community organisation. It could be a housing association that were well established in that area. And what they did was they took a level of the funding and enabled them to distribute and support some of that local activity. So covering maybe travel costs for volunteers or managing food distribution or things like that. And what Corra did was we worked with all these partners because we had those local connections and community links to identify who the right anchor organisations were and support them in managing those monies and those funds and getting that out into the local areas and to the local people that were doing a lot of that activity at that time.
And is there a particular fund or funds that you would highlight as good examples of where that community approach was adopted?
I think the fund that we mentioned in our written response about the community anchor fund, that's one that really did that, where the anchor organisations were pivotal and partners really worked together to highlight it. And as I say, it was bringing together lots of different organisations that were maybe established in the area but maybe hadn't all worked as well together at the time. And what it really did was highlight the ability to collaborate, the ability to build connections and links between sort of maybe larger organisations like a housing association with a really small community group. They were both doing really important stuff, and that fund enabled those connections really to bolster.
Thank you. Are there particular examples of funding applications that were granted that you would say were as a result of that community approach? Any good examples of that?
I think as we were coming out of lockdown, there was the Enabling Neighbourhoods and Communities Fund, which was basically monies from the Scottish Government to really help reconnect and support people to get back into their community and for activities to happen. And that fund was really designed to provide small sums of money to local groups, whether that was to enable them to put in have outdoor spaces so they could meet outdoor, or whether it was just to have do some local activities in the park with children and they just needed some more equipment. That fund really enabled that to do social connections, and I think that really highlighted the importance of communities and communities coming together. I think the other fund was the Wellbeing Fund, so the Open Wellbeing Fund, which again was about community organisations and charities really responding to the needs of communities. That was predominantly, although that was an open fund and open for both national and local, a high proportion of the funding was distributed at a local level, and that was a lot of support was provided around helping people with well-being, so people that were maybe feeling a bit anxious, isolated, struggling with mental health. A lot of support was provided there to put on digital provision, and again that fund also provided a lot of support around food, providing food and basic needs for people.
You've given some helpful examples there of things that were done well. Were there any examples of where perhaps funding or financial assistance was given that was less targeted or tailored to the local or community context?
I think there was probably a couple of examples where we didn't quite get the criteria right and meant that there was less focused or targeted approaches. I think one of the things, particularly in the early days when we had done the Third Sector Resilience Fund, we needed a criteria that would work with the volume that we anticipated. So we had set a limit for the level of unrestricted reserves or reserves in an organisation. So that's the kind of money that an organisation would need to keep themselves afloat. And we had set that about 12 weeks. And it was quite a kind of hard line. So it was like if you were over the 12 weeks, unfortunately you weren't successful. And if you were under, you were likely to get the funding. But actually what we recognised, there was a lot of nuances in the reserve. So people would say, well, actually, I might have that money now, but I'm spending it down because I need it to keep the lights on, to keep the utilities covered, or actually those reserves are already committed or restricted by another funder, and they haven't allowed me to shift those restrictions, or it's in capital. So it wasn't just a one size fits all. So I think we had to go back and revisit that criteria when we relaunched the Third Sector Resilience Fund for a second round, to really try and make that criteria a lot looser, or explain it more and enable people to access funding that probably needed it. I think another example was that there were certain communities that were often felt that a lot of the funds weren't reaching them, and particularly maybe Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, or people from travelling communities, a lot of the funds precluded them, or they weren't aware of them. So I think after the first rounds of funding, a lot of work was done to think about how we could maybe approach more of those communities, encourage them. That meant maybe looking at the application materials again to make sure they were easy to understand, accessible, but also doing a bit more targeted work with the data that we collated over the first few rounds, to then look who's missing, how do we work with maybe faith communities or faith organisations or others and other networks that we maybe hadn't done in the past, to say, look, can we promote these funds into your community so people could access them.
So an iterative approach.
Yes, very much so.
And that would have been working with the Scottish Government to enable that to happen? Yeah,
working with the Scottish Government, working with the partners that were all involved in the development and delivery of the funds, and also I think we'd also got some feedback from some of those organisations and leaders from these intermediaries and networks to say, actually, we've not accessed that funding. I think we needed to respond to them as well and think about how can we work alongside you to help that.
Thank you. Moving on then just to the sort of key impacts, I suppose, on third sector organisations. In one of the briefing papers which Corra provided to the inquiry, and for the inquiry's record, the reference for that August 2020 Insight briefing paper is SCI-COR XXX-4045. The loss of income is something which is highlighted in that briefing paper as, particularly significant, I think, for third sector organisations, events being cancelled, local fundraisers postponed, and so on. In headline terms, before we move on to talk about some of the specific funds that Corra was involved with, how would you sum up the financial impact on those third sector organisations of the pandemic? I think I think for the smaller organisations that I was predominantly in contact with, it was quite significant. Most of those organisations hadn't relied on trust or foundation funding. A lot of them had access funding either in their local area by sort of donations or by membership fees, things like that, and suddenly that money wasn't there. And therefore they were struggling to think about, where am I going to pay for the rent for the next month, where they maybe had staff, and a lot of these people were contacting us before the furlough scheme had come on board as well. So people were still going, well, we've got staff to pay, we're really worried about this, we can't meet those costs. Those were real worries for people, and a lot of these organisations are also volunteer-led as well. So management committee, this isn't their job, they're volunteers, they are doing things in their communities, and just really worried about maybe one or two staff members and just trying to keep things going. So yeah, it was a significant thing. Lots of calls we took about with people feeling very anxious and worried about the money. And you mentioned volunteers. Did that number drop or increase as a result of pandemic restrictions or things that were put in place at that time? I think following the pandemic, we looked at Volunteer Scotland's statistics, and they've seen an increase in volunteering. Sorry, I'm going to have to pause you there. I think I'm being told that Lord Brailsford's possibly having sound issues at the moment, okay. So apologies. No, stopping okay. Mid-flow there. Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Mr. Stephen. Sorry, the voice got distorted and the sound got distorted for a while there.
Nope, no problem at all. Now, I think, sorry to make you repeat yourself, but I think we're just in the midst of discussing, I think, the impacts on third sector organisations, and you'd mentioned the importance, I think, of volunteers, and then I think I was just asking you about the impact of the pandemic on those volunteer staff and numbers.
Yeah, so I think there was definitely, I think, a lot of people that were volunteering, particularly in the communities we worked alongside with our People in Place programme. They were slightly older people, and so they were shielding and stuff like that, so they kind of were less evident through the pandemic, but we also seen an increase, and we got this from sort of more Scottish national statistics done by Volunteer Development Scotland, where there was an increase in people volunteering and taking on different roles and activities in their communities just to help out. So there was definitely a flux of people who were more regular volunteering, who had maybe had more impacted on the pandemic and a real impact for them and their family members, and then an increase of people taking on more roles and activities in a much more ad hoc way, so less of that kind of regular engagement, but just helping out a bit more.
Thank you. I want to move then to the funds with which Corra was involved in the distribution of. And one of those, you've mentioned it already, but I want to go to it in a bit more detail, is the Third Sector Resilience Fund. Can we start off then just by asking what the aim of that fund was and the primary purposes for which funds were being distributed from that fund, please?
So the Third Sector Resilience Fund was basically to try and keep the lights on for third sector organisations. So the purpose was just to give money to cover core costs, and that would include rent, utilities, predominantly any mortgage payments that maybe an organisation had, if there was anything like that was applicable. And I think the other thing was, like, as I say, it was before furlough, so it was like essential staff. So if you were a community centre and you needed a caretaker to go in and check things were happening, you could cover the costs for that caretaker. So it was those essential costs, and it was open to any third sector organisation across Scotland. And as I've said earlier, the diversification of third sector organisations was from very large national charities to really small community groups. You had to have a constitution. So basically a constitution sets out how often you meet, that you have an annual general meeting to talk through set up your board, those kind of things. So you had to have a constitution, and in the first phase you had to have less than 4 months reserves. So that was 4 months kind of running costs available to you to go. So that was the kind of core criteria for that fund.
And what were the sums of money that were being distributed? So
we were kind of sorry, I can't quite remember.
No,
it's on my notes. But so there was it was millions of pounds that went through the Third Sector Resilience Fund, and we were working with organisations that were maybe that had income of less than under £100,000. Initially, the criteria was that it would be a minimum grant of £5,000 to one organisation, but we recognised there was lots of groups out there that they would never have been eligible to access the funding, so we got that reduced, and I think our smallest grant was maybe about £2,000, and our largest grant that we made, because there was other partners delivering bigger sums of money, was maybe about £25,000–30,000.
And I think you say in the Relate response that Corra was administering that fund in partnership with others. So
That's
again,
right.
how did that work in practice, that partnership?
So the partnership was between ourselves, First Port, and Social Investment Scotland. Ourselves and First Port were doing the sort of grant administration, with ourselves administering the grants for organisations with under £100,000, and First Port administering grants to organisations that had income above that. And Social Investment Scotland, their element was to provide a loan facility if organisations wish to choose that and take that on board. And we would meet regularly. So we, at the early stages, we met 2 times a day to talk about the design and development of the application material and fund, and then we would meet they would then go onto a daily basis to talk about it. We regularly shared information about the organisations that were applying to us, and like making sure we were managing that well, and the volumes could manage out a bit more evenly. We would track our budgets together on a daily basis, and we would just track and discuss anything that was emerging or any concerns we had. We were also able to look and see if there was organisations that we knew in the mix of the, either one of our lists, so we could manage conflicts of interest, things like that.
You mentioned, I think, the wide range of third sector organisations who could apply and did apply. Were they all familiar with seeking funding? Was this something that a process they had been through before and applied for?
No, definitely not. That was something that became quite starkly obvious to us, particularly with some of the smaller organisations. Many of them had never applied to a fund before, so even just the language that we use on application materials, where you ask about accounting information, where it maybe says I need to understand your income, your expenditure, your reserves, these terminologies were very new to particularly very small organisations, so they didn't know what we were looking for or what we required. So it was quite difficult for them, and I think that, coupled with the anxiety of worrying about just trying to keep their organisation open, meant that it was quite challenging. So a number of them were unsuccessful in their first attempt at applying, and then they would phone us up and have a conversation, and we would try to talk through them, what the kind of key things we were looking for and what mattered, and then they were able to reapply and potentially get a successful application. But it was a real challenge. Most of these organisations hadn't even heard of people like First Port or Corra, so this was all very new to them.
And you talked about trying to keep the lights on, I think, when we asked you about the aim of that fund. So at least initially then, from what sounds like what you're saying, is that might have been a hurdle or a barrier to accessing or obtaining that funding. Definitely
a hurdle or barrier just for people to get it, and people were, as I said, very anxious and very worried when they were phoning up. They were just desperate to just get some money just to keep things open, because a lot of them were like really pivotal in their community, like small sports clubs that were doing a lot of good work, and they were just like, they would phone me up and say, you're asking about income and expenditure. I just take the fees in on a weekly basis and then I pay the rent. I don't know what you're looking for. And we say, have you got that written down on a sheet or anything? And they go, yes. I mean, just send us that. That's all we're looking for. So it was really just talking through all these kind of things for people that just felt like an even bigger hurdle at that time because of everything else that was happening.
I think you talked earlier about meeting, I think, perhaps twice daily at some points. Were changes therefore made to simplify that application process?
I think we tried to simplify the language that we were using in the application form and simplify the language we were using in our communications to make it more easier for people to understand what we were looking for. We didn't initially change the criteria in the first round of funding, but then there was a pause where we could really reflect and after the first few months to really think about what we had learned, and then when we adapted it, we changed the form quite considerably and changed the criteria to make it easier for people to apply.
And in terms of getting feedback on that application process, how was that being achieved? Were there surveys being done? What was happening?
So during the pandemic ourselves, so that sort of first month, Corra didn't actually undertake any surveys. We knew a lot of other funders and partners were doing lots of surveys, and we felt that was about too much to add another one onto organisations. But we were in daily communication with applicants and grant holders, just asking about queries. So what we did was we did some internal reflection sessions with our staff team just to understand what they were telling us and what people were saying, and then we were able to use that knowledge to help really think about how we adapt and progress and make things easier for people. Later on, like in 2021-22, we did more surveys which reflected on the experience of the pandemic, which we've now incorporated more into our work. But at that time, it was more just hearing those conversations from people and the communities directly to us.
In terms of the time it took or the pace of those changes being made to the application process, I mean, was that a quick process or?
It probably was quick in terms of funders, but probably not for the people on the ground. So we were probably looking at changes taking a wee bit of time, maybe 1 or 2 months to really adapt and change and really reflect it. We were very mindful that we wanted to get it right and try and really embed the lessons. But for people on the ground working on that, waiting when's the next fund going to open, that probably felt a bit longer than they'd anticipated.
Thank you. And I've been asking you questions about the Third Sector Resilience Fund, but these issues, hurdles, whatever we want to call them, in respect of applications to seek funding, did Corra, in Corra's knowledge, did those issues crop up in respect of other funds beyond this one?
Yes, so we were, as I say, we were involved with a number of funds, and I think the conversations about application criteria, the form feeling accessible, I think were definitely evident in a lot of the other programmes we did. I think some of the other programmes were more, I should say, some of the other funds, the organisations applying to them were more used to applying to trusts and foundations, so it was probably less of that feedback about the application language, but the questions about the criteria and some of the content in application forms were definitely relevant across the whole funds.
Thank you. Now, earlier in your evidence, I think you mentioned the Travelling Show People's Fund as an example of a gap that was identified, or communities that weren't being reached. Are there any other particular funds that you would highlight to the inquiry that were also set up based on perhaps feedback you were getting from communities?
So I think the Travelling Show People's Fund was a direct response from that community directly to the Scottish Government, and then the Scottish Government responded in that. Another couple of funds that were identified that I think were about ones that were identified where groups had been missed was there was a fund set up that we administered to support food. So not just about food provision, food shares, but also providing more culturally sensitive foods. Again, that was a direct input from the Scottish Government. So those organisations approached the Scottish Government and said, look, you're not responding appropriately enough to the provision of food. The Scottish Government asked us to administer that fund. Another one that had been identified was also to the charities working with Army veterans. They felt that they hadn't been accessed enough to some of the wider fund and provision, and Scottish Government put in a support structure for them as well. They were the ones that we were aware of and involved in.
Thank you. And I think you said in your evidence earlier on in the Relate response about the importance of the role of communities and third sector organisations. To Corra's knowledge, what funding, if any, was made available to support staff well-being in those third sector organisations?
I think there was probably limited funds really around staff well-being in there. Staff in third sector organisations and also volunteers were going above and beyond to really respond to the communities and the people that were there to support. A lot of the fund criteria that were set up in emergency response were very much around dealing with the pandemic, putting in structures in place to enable those organisations to be in place, providing provision for the people and communities that they were there seeking to serve, and very few funds, or there wasn't a huge sum of money available or flexibility within those funds to really think about staff wellbeing or support and volunteers. We did administer the Enabling Neighbourhoods and Communities Fund, which was more as we came out of lockdown, where some of the money, where there was a bit more flexibility in some of the monies, and some of those community groups used that to really thank volunteers and to give them some kind of provision of support to really help them and acknowledge their role through the pandemic.
Thank you. I want to ask you now about sort of key impacts on communities that were being supported by these third sector organisations, and again the Relate response helpfully lists those funds that Corra was either administering or in partnership or otherwise, including the Food Fund and the Community Wellbeing Fund, two that are mentioned. Of those funds with which Corra was involved, did any kind of themes or patterns emerge in the funding applications that were being submitted that indicated to you perhaps the key difficulties or issues that communities were facing? during the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think the kind of key thing was definitely around food was obviously a big thing, and it came across every fund about providing food provision, so grocery delivery, but also actually providing food to people. A lot of people who had found themselves in a position which maybe had never accessed a charity or services or support before, because they maybe lost their job, they had an impact of being furloughed, so they were really dealing with that. We've seen an increase in organisations trying to provide more digital services. That was obviously a big impact both for the organisations, because they were having to move to digital platforms, so they were having to upskill staff and use of digital tools and online facilities, but also for people in access and support via digital responses, and a lot of things around mental health provision, citizen advice, so a lot of things around just basics about social citizen advice bureau services, such as advocacy around welfare, different things like that for people. We also seen people trying to think about how do you keep social connections going. So social connections is a huge thing for people, particularly around the loneliness that many people felt during the pandemic. So that was another big thing. And again, trying to do that in a digital way, particularly, was a huge thing. We knew there was a big gap in digital provision, and I know there was further responses provided by Scottish Government around digital support, but there was a lot of money spent on providing equipment, but also payment for broadband and things like that for people so they could actually stay connected.
And on that digital inclusion issue, were there particular funds that were being sought from?
Yeah, so the Wellbeing Fund, the Open Call Wellbeing Fund, was the main one that we used for digital inclusion, but some of the community anchor organisation funds as well provided digital support.
Sorry, apologies, I'm told that Lord Brailsford may have lost sound again. My Lord, can you hear us? No, it appears not. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Good morning, my lord.
Right, good morning, Miss Stephen. I'm very sorry about this, and I'm very sorry for you, Miss Wilson. I apologise. It's a technical hitch is all I can tell you. I'm afraid I don't know, needless to say, what the nature of it.
No problem at all, my lord. I'm conscious of time, so I'll press on.
Yeah, it's not your fault, don't worry.
Thank you. Wanted to then ask you about disproportionately impacted groups during the pandemic. Corra helpfully provided a written submission that was made to the Scottish Parliament's Equalities and Human Rights Committee on the impact of COVID on equalities and human rights. And for the record, the reference for that report is SCI-COR XXX-4042. Now, in that document, it states at page 1 that the impact of the COVID pandemic was not felt equally across Scotland. My question I wanted to ask you was, in terms of access to financial support, the funding that we've been talking about today, are there any group or groups that you would highlight as disproportionately impacted?
As I said before, I think there was Black, Asian and minority-led community groups that were, didn't access as proportionality the level of funding they should have. We did, when we did reviews of funds, look to do more targeted approaches to try and reach them more, doing data analysis through networks and links. Corra itself, not through the funds we administered, were able to deliver a small fund to support Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities on the back of COVID to some groups, and we've continued to look at how we reduce barriers and enable more of those groups to come forward for future funding from us, using and making better use of data as well, so actually asking more questions that help us understand the makeup of organisations and group to understand who we're reaching, who we're not reaching. But that was definitely one of the groups that felt most impacted during the pandemic, and we certainly spoke to a number of community members. I remember having conversations with Sikh community about lack of access to funds and how we can really support them and do more targeted outreach to connect those organisations.
Can I ask, you've touched on it to an extent there, but can I ask what you think perhaps the main reason or reasons for that gap was? Is it digital inclusion, language barriers? What do you think the reasons might be?
I think it's a combination. Of many of those things. Definitely, digital was one of the things. A lot of the processes. It was also digital online forms, so you could only access the funding via an online form. So sometimes not everyone has access to computers or digital or feel digitally literate. So actually providing alternative formats and sources to access funding. Language is another thing. So we talked about small community groups. Not understand some of the accountancy terminologies that we were talking about, but also if English isn't your first language, and the terminology we set out to describe what we're looking for can sometimes make it a barrier for people to feel that they can't access it. And also just I suppose we go through the networks that we know, so it's about how do you reach out beyond those existing networks that we know to try and reach other networks and other communities to make them aware the fund is available, and also to make it feel more equitable and that the fund is there for them. So it's actually how we did a lot more targeted conversations to try and reach people.
Thank you. And that leads me on really to ask you about how Corra operates now. I suppose you're touching there on the learning process, but how would you say the COVID pandemic has impacted on how Corra now operates as a funder in terms of its funding practices?
I think we've shifted quite significantly since the pandemic. We are a funder that it looks to be much more equitable and accessible in our processes. We've looked at our application materials across the board, so we look at the relevance of the questions we ask, so that we're only asking for questions where we're going to use the information, and we tell people how we use the information. We've made it to most of our applications to be in plain English, so trying not to use language that feels intimidating or feels like it would need lots of explanations. We've also put in steps to try and increase our reach to some of those organisations that have often felt barriers to funding. So that's things like alternative formats to applying, so not always needing to do it online or in a written format. We've also offered alternative payment options, so many groups, if you don't have a bank account, then you're restricted to accessing funding. So Corra's put in steps for, particularly for small grants that we offer, where people can access either get someone else to hold the money for them, like a trusted organisation that they know, or there's an online platform that we use where the money can go in and it just looks like a shared bank account platform, and Corra will pay for the resources. So providing alternative sources and connections to people. I think the other thing that we've done that I mentioned was we've reviewed how we collect diversity, equity, inclusion information, so that we're actually better understanding about the organisations that apply to Corra, about their makeup, about who the people they're trying to reach, and from that information really understanding about who's missing from the picture, and is there more work we can do to try and reach and target them and support them in a much more equitable way.
And those efforts that you mentioned Corra has made, are they reflected across funders more generally, or is that something, well, the inquiry is obviously interested in lessons that might be learned from the pandemic, is that something you would like to see mirrored more widely?
I think definitely something that could be mirrored more widely. I think since the pandemic, there's been a UK-wide initiative called Open and Trusting Grant-Making Principles, which came out basically about from the pandemic, predominantly with independent funders. But the purpose was about we all shifted to be much more flexible, be more fluid, take away a lot of our bureaucracy, a lot of our reporting requirements. And then after the pandemic, a lot of it kind of shifted back a bit. The open and trusting grant-making movement is a set of 8 principles, which is much more about how do you put more trust in the relationship between funder and recipient of funding, so much more relationship-based, offer more flexibility in funding. So when I talked about the fact that many organisations weren't able to use a lot of the funds to offer staff wellbeing, if you had more flexibility around the funds, then the organisation then can direct the funding best suited to the needs of them, including staff wellbeing, but also about things about less bureaucratic reporting, so maybe not quarterly reportings or just asking reports because you want it, but actually much more meaningful reporting. And that movement has been around since just after the pandemic, and there's I think over 100 UK funders signed up to that movement, and Corra is one of them. So there's principles like that I definitely think there's lessons there that we can really adapt and progress going forward.
Thank you. I think you very helpfully encapsulated some lessons there already. So to the extent not already covered, is there anything else that you would wish to add that you think perhaps could or should be done differently in the event of another pandemic or similar event?
I think there's a couple of things there. I think the Scottish Government was really responsive and quick to react in terms of the funds it distributed, and I think it was really agile in bringing the collaborations it brought together, and partners really worked really well. I think at times there was a lot of funds happening all at the same time, which I think could lead to confusion for organisations. You could apply to one fund for your core costs, another fund to get wellbeing costs, so there's something in there about if something like this was to happen again, how do you actually start to streamline some of that and make it more accessible so that it feels much more fluid for organisations and those seeking support. I think there's definitely things about there was a huge sum of money went into the third sector, which was really important and really valuable and definitely needed. But we're still facing the impact of COVID and people are still living the impact of COVID and the cost of living, which is added to it. But that level of funding, while I appreciate it can't be sustained, that money just kind of dropped off. And so people are now going, how do I continue to manage and support the people in my communities where those kind of things are happening? So I think there's those kind of lessons. And I think the third and final thing I would say is the open and trusting grant-making principles that I talked about how do you become a funder where there's relational, become less bureaucratic, or feel about what's the proportionality of bureaucracy in terms of managing funds and due diligence. How do some of those lessons sit within the public sector funding as well? Because there was flex there during the pandemic, so some of those lessons I think are important to think about how we adapt and build them in, so it contains a much more trusting relationship going forward, which I think would help with any pandemic going forward or emergency response as well. It would allow funds to flow freer and allow more responsive action on the ground as well.
Thank you very much. My Lord, I don't have any further questions for this witness, subject to anything you wish to ask or add.
No, not at all. Thank you very much, Mr. Stephen. All that remains for me to do is thank you, Miss Wilson. I'm very sorry that your evidence was interrupted a little bit, but I think we've managed to get it. In any event, we have, as you say, your Rule 8 response, which we will look at. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, my Lord.
We'll take a break now, and we'll come back, shall we say, at 25 to 12?
Okay. Thank you, my Lord.
Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Mr. Turner. Now, you have a panel for us now.
We do indeed, my lord.
Right. Good morning. It's Mr. Napier, Miss Christie and Mr. McMillan, isn't it?
It is. Sorry, excuse me, my lord. There's just some water being delivered. We're just a little bit behind here. Excuse me.
That's all right. Now, I'll say it again. Good morning, Mr. Napier, Miss Christie and Mr. McMillan.
Good morning.
Right. I'm sure Mr. Turner's got some questions for you. So
thank you, my lord.
Fire away. Thanks.
Good morning. Are we still? We are just about. Good morning. Yes. Before we begin, if I could just remind you that this morning's panel, this afternoon's panel, will be transcribed. If you could try and speak slowly and clearly, that will help the stenographers. If you could also try not to speak over each other. Unlike Teams, the stenographers struggle if there's more than one voice going on at once. Could I ask you each, please, to state your full name, where you work, and your role, and if there's any distinction between that and what was going on during the pandemic, if you could also indicate that to us, I'd be grateful. If I could start with you, Mr. Napier. You don't need to touch your mic. Your mic will be live throughout. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Benjamin Napier. I'm Chief Executive of the Citizens Advice Services in Edinburgh, and that was the same role that I held during the lockdown.
Thank you. And Mrs. Christie?
I'm Claire Christie, Chief Exec at Dundee Citizens Advice Bureau. I was Bureau Manager in North West Aberdeenshire during lockdown.
Thank you. And Mr. McMillan?
My name is Angus McMillan. I'm the EHU Performance and Insights Manager, and EHU is part of Citizens Advice Scotland, and I had that role during the pandemic.
Thank you. And you used the term there, EHU, Mr. McMillan. What is the EHU?
So yes, that's the Extra Help Unit. It's a statutory service that supports energy consumers across GB.
Thank you. You attended a roundtable meeting on the 28th of May 2024 with other members of Citizens Advice in Scotland. A report of that roundtable meeting was produced and approved. My Lord, the reference of that report is SCI WT 04581. My Lord, I would just note that there is one typographical error that I noticed in the report, in that it is entitled as a meeting of the 29th of May. The body of the report does confirm the correct date was the 28th of May.
Right.
This morning I'm going to ask you some questions relating to the discussions that happened in that round table. We do have a limited amount of time this morning. Just to confirm that everything that was discussed in that round table indeed was reported. Other documents will be taken into account even if we don't discuss them this morning, but hopefully we'll get an opportunity to touch upon the main issues. Mr. Napier, by way of a brief introduction, could I please ask you to give His Lordship a brief description of Citizens Advice in Scotland?
Yes, so Citizens Advice is a network of Citizens Advice bureaus across Scotland. There are, I think, 59 members. Each of the members are independent organisations. So, like Claire and myself manage an independent Citizens Advice bureau in a particular location of the country. We are branded together by way of a set of membership conditions which we need to meet, and those are overseen by Citizens Advice Scotland, which is the Association of Citizens Advice Bureaus in Scotland. So we're kind of joined together by virtue of our membership. We provide free, confidential, independent advice and support to anyone who needs it in the community. We do that primarily in Citizens Advice Bureau, so physical shopfront building where people can access face-to-face advice, but we also provide advice by telephone, online, email, and we also provide a range of outreach services in various locations around the locality that will be done in partnership, for example, maybe in courts or GP practices, hospitals, any location where we believe that the presence of a citizens advice provision would add value to the needs that people have in that particular location.
Thank you. And Mr McMillan, you referred to the fact that you work at the Extra Help Unit. Could you just give his lordship a description very briefly as to how that operates?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a little bit different. We are directly employed by Citizens Advice Scotland. We have statutory duties under the SEER Act, so Section 12 and 13 of that Act. Section 12 is to support consumers that need additional advice on energy matters because they can't progress the case on their own. And Section 13 is to support consumers who are at risk of losing their supply through disconnection or other concerns. So for a GB-wide service, our funding is through a levy on network companies across Great Britain. That funding is then provided to the Extra Help Unit from the Department of Business and Trade for English and Welsh consumers, and from the Scottish Government for Scottish consumers. And we are completely online. We don't have a face-to-face function. Referrals come to the Extra Help Unit from Citizens Advice Consumer Service for England and Wales. And at the time of the pandemic, that was also the case for Scotland. Sort of more recently in 2021, that changed to Advice Direct Scotland, providing those referrals into the Extra Help Unit. So it's really referrals into the unit. There's no sort of direct contact number to come straight through to us.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you now some questions about changes to the operation of Citizens Advice Bureau during the pandemic. Mr Napier mentioned the fact that generally advice prior to the pandemic was offered on a face-to-face basis. Did that continue during the pandemic?
To begin with, no. So it was a big change for us at the beginning of the first lockdown. Prior to that, the majority of advice would have been given face-to-face. So at the beginning of the first lockdown, we needed to find solutions to how we were going to be able to provide a service when people weren't going to be able to leave their homes and come to a physical premises that we had. What I would say is that the CAB network generally mobilised services very quickly and very effectively. So our telephone system was an online telephone system which enabled us then to provide our advisors access to an app to be able to then get access to our internal telephone system, so they could both make and receive incoming phone calls to our mainline number, but they could also call clients back through that. Also, our kind of database was available online, so people were able to access that remotely from home. And also the databases of information that they use to be able to provide accurate and up-to-date advice and support to people were also available via our website, so our advisors could access that remotely from home. Majority of our advisors are volunteers. We do have some paid staff, but the majority are volunteers, and so we were relying on them agreeing to continue to provide their voluntary service from home, normally with access to their own IT equipment to enable them to do that. So we were very fortunate that people responded positively to that, were willing to continue to give their time remotely from home, and that our IT setup enabled us to be able to then move quite quickly to changing the service to enable people to continue to phone us, but also for advisors to make calls from home. That meant that really from the first few days of the lockdown, we were back delivering services to clients who were in need by telephone or email. And then as time progressed and people got more confident with using video conferencing, there was a small amount of that took place as well. So that's how things started to begin with.
Thank you. And Ms. Christie, Mrs. Christie, sorry, have you anything to add to that? Was there any changes as matters progressed through the pandemic? In terms of physical changes, for example, in offices?
Physical changes, we were all awarded funding. UK Government and Scottish Government gave us funding to change the physical setups of a lot of our bureau so that we could safely see clients in bureau again. I would say probably throughout lockdown the vast majority of advice was remote, but when we were able to secure our physical premises for safe contact, that made a big difference to particularly vulnerable clients, people who were digitally excluded, had missed out for several weeks or months of gaining really important advice and support. So it was crucial to be able to support them again as well, and have members of the public come into Bureau both for advice and support, but also helping other third sector organisations such as food banks, where we were able to distribute food, fuel vouchers and the like as well. That made a big difference.
Thank you. And Mr McMillan, you've heard Mr Napier and Ms Christie there, Mrs Christie, excuse me, talking about the speed of change of the Bureau. What was the position with the extra help unit?
It was very much the same. We'd had a little kind of insight into kind of what could happen if we couldn't access the office, because everyone at the extra help unit at that time was office based. We only worked from the office, and we'd seen sort of with the what was it, anti-cyclone Harmot, Beast from the East is probably more commonly known, back in February 2018, the kind of challenges of continuing the service if we couldn't access the office, and that was only obviously for 3 days, but it gave us a little bit of insight. So we had started a little bit of planning at that time. I don't think enough, given what we wouldn't have known, was to come in 2020, but it did sort of start helping us kind of think about how we would deliver the service from home. Quite different though when you're trying to get all members of staff to home working. So that had to really be pushed through, and it was a project which, if you're planning it normally, you probably put months into the planning, but we really had to do it within a turnaround of a couple of weeks to get sort of home working. I think the thing that we're pleased about is that we were able to answer 95% of calls throughout that period. We obviously identified members of staff that needed to go to home working immediately due to maybe health conditions or health conditions within their own households, even if it didn't affect them directly. So we need to get those people home working as quickly as possible. Others sort of worked from the office for a number of days, but we were able to get everyone home working quickly, and I think sort of the technology and things that were put in place, we were able to do that really quite quickly. But it was a challenge getting things like laptops, making sure everyone had all the right equipment. We had to just try and get equipment from wherever we could source it in those days to keep the service running.
Thank you. You've mentioned there, Mrs Christie, that there was financial support for some of the physical changes that were being made to offices, etc. Mr Napier and Mrs Christie, was there any other financial support available in respect of changes that were being made to operations?
I think some of our external funders were quite open to additional funding or changes to the way that we utilised the funding that we'd received for specific projects, so that we could meet any of the new aims and objectives that we had to specifically help the people that needed it most at the time. And I think that was so beneficial. And I think it really created a good rapport with a lot of the funders, local authorities included, external grant givers. But I think being able to help those who were digitally excluded, who were more vulnerable, became a key aspect of the service that we provided at that point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was certainly impressed with the way that both governments, UK and Scottish Government, responded with assistance in provision of PPE. So there were provisions of face masks, hand gels, antibacterial wipes and things that enabled us to open our offices. We wouldn't have really had the financial resources to have been able to have purchased that, but we probably would have struggled to be able to get access to that. So we were given access to what the government were procuring, but we were also given some funds to be able to purchase that type of equipment. And then there was additional funding to make physical adaptations later on in the lockdown in order for the premises to be open safely, to enable social distancing, to being able to open the premises in a safe way. And I was impressed with the way in which that funding came quite quickly, but it was also given without unnecessary restrictions being applied. So there was a trust that we were going to use that funding in a sensible and appropriate way for which it was needed. But I was impressed that it was given quickly, and it made a significant difference to us being able to open and operate and provide services at an early stage in a safe way as well.
Thank you. You mentioned there, Mr Napier, access to PPE or funding for access to PPE. Did you have any difficulties accessing PPE at the time?
I don't remember there being too much problems. I think the procurement process for us made it much easier and allowed us to buy in bulk. And with the funding that we'd secured from both governments, that was crucial. Locally, a lot of suppliers turned their hand to PPE, which again helped local suppliers providing face masks, partitions, things like that as well, and having the funding to purchase that quickly just helped us to continue our service as successfully as we did.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't recall any difficulties in being able to access it. And as the pandemic continued, some big corporations in the city that had sort of bought on bulk and had excess PPE were also reaching out to the third sector then to see if we were able to utilise that, and we were able to then get access to additional product as a result of that. So yeah, we certainly had sufficient supplies and had them in a pretty timely manner.
Thank you. You've mentioned that the Citizens Advice Bureau are run predominantly by volunteers. I just wonder if you could tell His Lordship whether there are any particular impacts on those volunteers and their ability to provide the continuing assistance.
Yeah, well, I go first. Yeah, so there was an impact. I mean, first of all, I would say it was really positive that we had so many people who continued to volunteer during the lockdown, and there's no doubt that the provision of services we were able to offer was only as a result of people continuing to volunteer their time, and that was under what was very difficult circumstances for themselves, but also for the first time they were providing the advice and support that they would normally provide in the safety and security of a bureau premises. They were doing that from within their own home. So all of the stress and the challenges, the anxiety and the worry that the public were facing, our volunteers were then taking that into their own homes and dealing with those conversations with people in their own homes. And it's a huge credit to them that they stepped up and offered their time free of charge to be able to do that. But the impact was we did lose a lot of volunteers. There were, at the beginning of the lockdown, a lot of our volunteers just didn't either have the confidence to be able to provide the advice remotely from home. Some didn't have the infrastructure to be able to do it, maybe the right IT equipment or access to suitable kind of Wi-Fi or access to a private space within their own home to be able to do it. So there was a lot of people who weren't able to volunteer. And then as the lockdown went on for so long, there was simply a significant period of time between them volunteering for us and when they were able to get back. As a result, they sort of drifted away from the service and didn't return to it. A kind of second impact once we came back to physical premises was people's anxiety about coming back into what is a very close proximity engagement with multiple different people. So with a volunteer model, you simply have a lot more personnel involved in the delivery of your service, but when you're seeing thousands of people from the public, your interactions are with multiple different people. So even with the PPE and the social distancing, quite understandably, some people were concerned about going back to that sort of level of interaction. As a result, there was lots of volunteers who never returned to our service again. So the impact was a loss of about 50% of our volunteers, and we are continuing now in 2024, continuing to struggle to rebuild that numbers back up to the kind of pre-pandemic numbers that we had and the numbers that we need to sort of meet levels of demand at the moment.
Mrs. Christie, was your experience similar?
No. I think I was obviously in a rural bureau at the time, and our experience was very different. We already had remote working policies in place. Winter in rural Aberdeenshire can be quite nasty, so people tended to work remotely anyway. So we were able to mobilise very quickly, and it meant the majority of our volunteers were already used to remote working of some sort. A lot of them worked from home. There was additional supervision and support having to be put in place as they were dealing with some quite significant issues at sometimes that really needed quite a concise debrief. Some of our volunteer team, as well as some of our staff team, because of their personal circumstances, either couldn't or didn't want to work from home, and because we were able to put in the physical adaptations very quickly, we were able to have them working within the premises. We had private premises at the time and could keep everybody quite separate, so there was no problem with social distancing at the time. Because of that, we were able to keep all of our staff and volunteers within that period. We had only a handful who weren't able to work for a few weeks or months at the beginning, but did come back when they were able to. And I think that bucked the trend nationally. Having them moved to Dundee, I know the picture was very different and very similar to the picture that Benjamin portrayed of a city bureau, where it was a very different story. In Dundee, we're based within the library, so we weren't able to open at that point, quite well on into lockdown. And because of that, all the volunteers had primarily worked within the bureau setting, and they did lose quite a number of volunteers at that point. And again, we're still far from pre-pandemic levels of volunteers. As and when we build that up, I don't know. But it was a very different picture, rurally and urban.
Can I just pick up two things that you mentioned there? You mentioned that the Aberdeenshire bureaus in private premises and the Dundee ones in a public building in a library. Mr. Napier obviously mentioned that bureau operate independently. Is that a common reflection that the tenure of bureau is different across the country?
Yes, very different.
And do you think that makes a difference in terms of what happened in terms of what you could do at the time?
I think for those of us that were in private or either rented or privately owned properties, it was much easier for us to be able to set our own rules and regulations, obviously matching within whatever legislation was at the time. For other bureau that were within co-located buildings, for example, it was very difficult to either be in your co-located position or to have to rely on a landlord to give you whatever access you needed at the time. And working within various bureaus over the last 5 years has just shown the difference that location can make.
Thank you.
Yeah, certainly similar for us. So we had 5 Citizens Vice bureaus in Edinburgh at the beginning of the lockdown. 4 of them were able to open, but the 5th one that didn't open was in a public library. And the challenge with those, well, one, the public premises weren't open, so we couldn't really get access to it. But these are also often old buildings, so it was impossible to make any physical adaptations to it, unlike the other buildings where it's just a fairly easy partition that you could take down, restructure somewhere else to make a room larger. You couldn't do that in that building, but it didn't have the proper ventilation either, so that was a cause of health and safety concern for people going back into it, where the premises couldn't be properly ventilated again. So it's good to be able to access what is a familiar public property like that in normal times, but what we experienced during the lockdown, and then we haven't been able to re-access that premises again since then, because the ventilation was a restriction to it. As an old building, there was a limit to what you could do to adapt it.
Thank you. You mentioned the loss of volunteers over the pandemic. Were there any additional volunteers coming forward at the time?
There was a number. We had quite a high level of applications throughout the initial lockdown. I think people that had been furloughed specifically wanted something to do. The problem that we had was the ability to train them up. Obviously, we have quite an extensive volunteer training programme, and there was a real inability, because we were providing such a high level of support to the people that were already in post. It was very difficult to take on anybody new and train them up successfully at the time. Some maybe came in as administrative help, support, and we had quite a lot of work that had to be done. Managing post, for example, there was quite a heavy rule on how you handled post that came in, how we then issued post going out. A lot of paperwork had to be created, which, coming from a paperless system, was slightly unusual for us, having to post out a lot of forms, and we had stationery packs sent out to people that were working remotely so that they could utilise equipment that we'd supplied to them at home to post out and things like that as well. So we were able to utilise some volunteers as administrative support, but we weren't able to take on the ones. A lot of people were furloughed short term, and it wouldn't have been an appropriate option anyway because of the extensive training programme.
Thank you. You've mentioned obviously the extensive work which volunteers were taking on over the pandemic. Was there any effect on them personally?
Yeah, as I said before, I think it was it was a really challenging time for people. They were having to, it was difficult for most people trying to sort of deal with the unusual circumstances we were having to live in, but when you were then having to support other people in that situation and do that from within your own home, then that was certainly a challenging thing for volunteers to deal with. And they didn't have access to the same sort of level of in-person support from their line managers that they would normally have, and they didn't have the same peer interaction that they normally have. So we tried to replicate that as much as possible with regular online Teams meetings where people could interact with their colleagues through that sort of forum, making sure that their line managers were keeping connected by phone or online with them as regular as they could. But it's no substitute for that kind of in-person interaction, or indeed having a premises where you go to where you can do your work and then leave that behind and go back home to your normal home environment. So the separation between those two things didn't exist when you were having to do it all within your own home. So it definitely had an impact, but there was also a very positive impact. The fact that volunteer population stepped up to try and help people during the pandemic and were motivated to do that. Certainly the volume of activity that our volunteers were undertaking increased. Some of that was simply the fact that they had time. A lot of people weren't working, they weren't able to go anywhere else, so the fact they were able to do it from home enabled them to have more time to help people. But they also just stepped up because they felt that they had a moral and ethical contribution, a valuable contribution that they could make to the public, and they stepped up to do that.
Thank you. You've mentioned the return to work and volunteers reaccessing the physical spaces of Bureau. We all know, of course, that there were restrictions on movements and access and in particular whether people were key workers or not at the time. Did that affect the work of the Bureau at all?
Yeah, I think when we come to the key worker aspect, it was very grey. It was so unclear for such a long time. I don't think we even now know what the true situation is. I know personally we had a number of volunteers, again, because we were working rurally, people were travelling further, and a number of volunteers were stopped by the police at that point in time, asking where they were going, why they were travelling. It was taken for granted at that time that because they were coming to Bureau, that was acceptable. Nobody ever had any other ramifications for that. But it took us quite a long time to get even a piece of paper that said we were equivalent to a key worker. It never specified that we were key workers. But thankfully that never became an issue. But it certainly caused concern by people that were travelling or chose to travel to Bureau to do their work or their volunteering.
Thank you. Is there anything that you think could or should have been done to alleviate that concern?
Just clarity and early on, the number of discussions that happened at various levels, both through Citizens Advice Scotland and then going to government, civil service, as to the work we were doing, how quickly we were doing it, how effectively we were doing it, classed us as key workers, but that clarification never came, and I think that would have made a difference, possibly to the number of volunteers that chose to return to work, but certainly just to ease people's conscience and help their peace of mind.
Thank you. You've you've spoken on a number of occasions regarding information being provided to volunteers, not least obviously discussions about key workers and access, etc. Did Citizens Advice have any systems in place for advising volunteers and others regarding the current position in terms of guidance from the government, etc.?
We have a really good advice system as it is, and I know that the people that manage it were trying to update it as quickly as possible. That got to the point where it could be numerous times a day. Things were changing. And we only had the information that was publicly available. We didn't have any insider knowledge or whatever else might be out there. And I think sometimes clients found that hard to understand, that we were having to do as much research as they were. But I would have to say the information that we got was good, it was concise, it was timely as much as it could be. And I think that really helped our advisors to be able to give as accurate and up-to-date advice as they could, and they were aware of that.
When you say it was concise and timely, information from whom are you referring to there? Do you mean information from government or information from CAS or information from other sources?
Yeah, a lot of external organisations would give us information. We were getting a lot of health and safety information. I think perhaps the information coming from government was slightly slower or maybe slightly more high level or generic than it could have been. I think it could have been much more to the point and more concise. But we were able, or CAS were able to ask the right questions to the right people, and we did get answers most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately with our structure, we are independent organisations, each bureau, so at the end of the day, as the Chief Executive, I'm responsible for people's health and safety, both the people accessing the services, but also our volunteers and our staff. So I was having to make a judgment based on various bits of information, stuff we were getting from UK government, stuff we were getting from Scottish government, interpretations that the Association of Citizens Advice Scotland made to that, and then I had to try and interpret that as well, come up with a health and safety policy for ourselves and decide that that was going to be good enough for us and something that I could stand by as a Chief Executive, and whatever happened, say that we had made an appropriate assessment. Was it helpful that there were so many different sources of information? I found information from the UK and Scottish government helpful, but I guess there could have been a greater consistency about, information that was coming out. But then it was related to, as best as they could, the differences that was going on in local areas of the country. So I guess ultimately, as I said, it comes down to a Chief Executive who has the health and safety responsibility for their organisation to ultimately make a decision and have something documented that they feel covers what the organisation needs and has been briefed to people. So I think there's never going to be an absolutely clear-cut way in which you can do that effectively. But there was quite a lot of information out there. We just needed to try and interpret that as best as we could. I think there was also an advantage as a voluntary organisation that we had access to a number of different personnel. So we have about 200 volunteers in Citizens Advice Edinburgh alone. And within that population, there were people with a specialist health background, so they were able to offer some guidance and some interpretation of guidance that was coming out as well. Now, again, it's up to me to decide whether I take that on board or utilise that, but I think as a voluntary organisation, you get access to a wider group of people than you might have within a small staff population, and there is a significant amount of expertise in the people that volunteer for our organisation. That was certainly of help to us as well during that time.
Thank you.
Could I add to that as well?
Yes, of course.
I just think that we need to applaud the inter-bureau relationships as well. I think there was such a supportive network at that point in time, and because at that time I wasn't a smaller bureau and didn't have as much specialist support, I think that was fed back to us and it was openly given, and that was a huge benefit as well. And not that it wasn't there before, it just heightened, and that's continued.
You said that's continued, which brings me nicely to my next point, which was you've mentioned a number of changes that have happened, moving services online, the ability to work at home remotely. Have any of those changes been sustained, or have matters moved back to the pre-pandemic position?
I think there's a good mixture now. I think it's been able to highlight new and improved ways of working. We haven't gone back to how it was pre-pandemic for good reason. I think there's been a lot of learning had there. New partnership workings have been successful, but also more remote ways of working, and having that multi-channel advice provision now has been so much more beneficial for the public.
Thank you.
Yeah, it has led to some new ways of working, and we have tried to sustain some of that, but there is a return to a high level of a demand for in-person advice. Now, that's not consistent across all of the country, so it certainly is the case in Edinburgh that there has been a return to a significant amount of in-person advice. And, yeah, we're probably the struggle that we have at the moment is how we try and balance the resources that are needed now to meet the needs of people who are still demanding that advice in person and are coming to physical premises, and the volume of people who are now able to also access our support by phone and online. And there's a massive gap simply between the demand and our ability to respond to that. And there is less funding now than what there was pre-pandemic. You know, a lot of the funding comes from public sector, and their finances are stretched. So we haven't been able to increase our resources to meet the level of demand, given the number of new opportunities that we made available to people to be able to access that service. So there is a degree of flexibility, but to have been able to have maintained that and responded to that level of demand, we would have needed more financial resource to be able to do that, and the financial resource hasn't been there.
Thank you. If I could now turn to the other side of the coin, if you like, in terms of, we've spoken about the experiences of the bureaus themselves. If I could perhaps ask you some questions regarding the experiences of clients and their experiences over the pandemic. We've talked about the changes in terms of how people access the service. Ordinarily, people would attend a bureau and have a face-to-face meeting, and most things moved on to a more digital, remote footing. What was the impact of that on clients?
In what respect?
Well, is it as easy for them to access that information remotely as it is in terms of face-to-face for everybody, for example?
Yes, not for everybody. Yeah, there are some people who just simply don't have access to the resources to be able to do that, either maybe access to a telephone, or certainly a telephone that has any credit on it for them to be able to make a call, or don't have access to the internet or the device to be able to access the internet on. So for some people it simply wasn't available to them, and they rely on that in-person, face-to-face advice. It's not only just about the medium by which they need to contact us, but some people, it's just easier for them to have an interaction in person. But also the types of advice that we provide people, they often need to come to us with lots of documents that they have. Now, some of that is available online now, and video conference enabled people to be able to share online content and online accounts that they have with an advisor, doing that remotely. But a lot of people just have bundles of paper letters that they're receiving from energy companies, debt collectors, government agencies, and they need to bring that physically in person to sit down with an advisor, go through all of that and try and make sense of it. So yeah, there's some of the ability to operate online has been beneficial, but it's not practical for everybody to be able to access their advice like that.
You've mentioned before questions of digital exclusion. Was that a serious issue for some of your clients?
Very much so. I think we've always dealt with people who are vulnerable, and obviously digital exclusion has become more and more prevalent, with more and more organisations requiring digital access. It was very much highlighted during the pandemic and nationally documented, but I don't think the situation's improved, and we definitely don't deal with any less clients that are digitally excluded. Far from it. It only seems to have heightened over the last few years. But there doesn't seem to be solutions put in place and the number of organisations requiring digital access to their services increases all the time.
What kinds of services are being required to be accessed digitally now?
That could be DWP services, Scottish Social Security, local authorities more and more have digital access to forums, to funding. Other charitable organisations, are often turning to digitally preferred options, and we don't see any less clients who have access to that.
Thank you. You mentioned there, Mrs. Christie, questions of funding applications and the like. Were there any changes to funding applications or how those were handled during the pandemic? For clients, this is in terms of welfare, etc.
For clients, yes, it was much easier, and it was much easier for us to be able to support them as well. There was, rather than the explicit consent as in a formal written signature that would be posted to an organisation, there was implicit consent that we were there as key workers to support a client. For example, if they were applying for welfare benefits, it became a much easier, much streamlined process. We were much better able to support clients if they were digitally excluded or if they required support from us. I don't think that's continued. Unfortunately, I think that was a possible silver lining at the time, and it's just a shame that things have fallen back into bad old habits.
Thank you.
Yeah, certainly access to welfare entitlement and supporting people with managing debt are two of the most common issues that we provide advice on, and during the pandemic, there was significant changes in both of those things. So welfare entitlement, one of the problems is that there are millions of pounds of unclaimed welfare entitlement. People struggle to understand their eligibility for it, and when they make claims, the claims are slow to process and quite difficult sometimes for people to understand. During the pandemic, that changed a lot. Applications were processed much more quickly, money was made available much more easily, and there were moratoriums on debt recovery in a number of areas, so people weren't being pursued for the debt in the same way. That was positive during that period of time, but then there's been issues post-pandemic about eligibility of welfare entitlement that people got, whether or not that was accurate at the time. So some people's claims are being reviewed and they might have to repay some money back again. Then the moratoriums on debt didn't mean that the debt went away. It simply meant you weren't being pursued for it at that time. And so we knew that there would come a time at which people were going to have to be pursued for that. So a lot of the support we were giving people during the pandemic was to remember that that debt wasn't going away. This was an opportunity for you to look at how you were going to manage to repay that debt once you were again being pursued for it. So there were positives, but whether or not we've been able to kind of continue to apply the same principles that we did at that time. That certainly hasn't been the case. The other significant change was the tribunals in relation to personal independence payments, so disability payments. A lot of our time was spent in-person representation at tribunals, and they would be protracted and take days of hearings before you'd reach any kind of conclusion. A lot of the time people weren't being forced to go to a tribunal, they were simply being given the welfare that they were applying for, so there was less appeals that were required, and then the process of the hearings went online, which made them much more efficient. There was less cancellations, there was less delays of people having to go in person, and the online tribunal process has continued. That certainly made it easier for us to be able to resource that and easier for people to get their hearings done, but from the digital exclusion point of view, it doesn't make it accessible for everybody, though, and there are certain people then that are maybe not pursuing an appeal because they don't feel that they can access that online process.
In terms of these, you've mentioned a number of positives in respect of those applications. Have any of those been sustained in terms of speed of dealing by the authorities?
To some extent, in relation to universal credit, I think it has. There was a transition with disability benefits anyway from personal independence payments, which was managed by the DWP and the UK government, transitioned to Scotland during that time, and Social Security Scotland took that over, and it's now adult disability payments. I mean, it's so there was a kind of a double whammy of, you know, the change from the lockdown to then the entire disability benefit system being devolved to Scotland, and yeah, it's not remained as efficient as it could have done. There are certainly delays in people's applications for access to adult disability payments. So yeah, that has slowed certainly.
You've obviously mentioned the changes there, but I suppose what I'm asking is the benefits in terms of the speed. One must assume that there were changes in the way that applications were being processed at the time. Is the same ethos being applied in terms of those applications, or are they being looked at more strictly now than they might have been over the pandemic, for example?
Yeah, I think they've gone back to being looked at more strictly. Yeah, I think there was a desire during the pandemic to make sure that nobody was left without the financial help that they might needed. Yeah, I think that's changed now, that people look at it much more rigorously than what they were at that time.
I think there was a high level of secondment within the organisations as well to be managing the frontline services, and that made a huge difference as well. The number of people that were assessing claims, for example, massively increased, so decisions were quicker, they were more effective, and that hasn't continued. Thank you.
Could I ask you, please, just a couple of questions about information and guidance that were being provided to clients at the time? Mr. Napier, you mentioned there the question of payment holidays and debt enforcement suspension, and that people weren't really understanding what that meant. Could you expand upon that, Mrs. Christie, maybe?
At the time, there was a lot of noise about payment holidays. For example, if people had debt, they could take payment holidays. If somebody was furloughed, they could have a payment holiday on their debt. What wasn't made clear was payment holidays weren't just that'll stop and then continue at some point in the future. The debt was accruing, the interest was accruing, the term was going to continue, so that would extend as well. And that was some creditors were making it clear, obviously, but people were either choosing not to pay attention to that information, or it wasn't being made clear in a lot of instances. And I think that was something that we were trying quite hard to take on board and make people aware of. It wasn't a simple, this payment holiday for the next 6 or 12 months is a good solution whilst you're on furlough. The debt could have actually been increasing during that period of time, and that wasn't made clear to members of the public. And I think it became part of our social policy regime to make people aware of that.
Thank you. Did that have any particular effect in terms of the levels of debt that you're seeing now?
I think the levels of debt haven't decreased, and obviously for some people they have increased because they kept the payment holidays going for as long as they could. The interest accrued throughout that period, so the levels of debt have increased and the terms of payment have increased, so people are still in debt, and yeah, the levels of debt have gone up in general.
Yes, certainly our experience, we're dealing with an increased volume of debt the clients are presenting with, but it's difficult to say whether that is a direct result of the pandemic and the information that was given to people at that time, because at the same time what we've had is an increase in energy prices. People are struggling to pay that. There's been an increase in rent and mortgages as well, so people are struggling to pay that. There's an overall increase in cost of living, so that means there's an impact on other things that people need to pay for. So it's difficult to attribute it directly to the impact of the information in a lockdown alongside just the general increase in costs for people, and as a result of that there's an increased level of debt.
Thank you. Mr. McMillan, there was mention there of energy debt. Obviously that's clearly straight in your wheelhouse. Could you perhaps give his lordship a bit of an indication of some of the difficulties people were experiencing in terms of energy issues at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest increase we saw was in priority cases. So, and this has started a little bit before the pandemic. We'd seen the number of people contacting us with problems affording to top up the prepayment meter. It was an ever-growing number, and it's grown again since with the increase in wholesale prices with the war in Ukraine and things. But during that initial stage of lockdown, a lot of people were on furlough, a lot of people at home more, so they were using more energy during the day that they weren't used to, and we had less money to actually pay for that as well. So there was a lot of need basically for suppliers to step in and provide additional support credit, which would help keep those consumers on supply. But that's something which has to be paid back, and if people are unable to pay it back, it can also build up over time. So we've kind of looked at things, providing fuel vouchers, having access to fuel vouchers now, other additional support that we can help with. We've got a small group that can contact sort of housing providers and look at sort of whether there's energy efficiency measures and things that can be put in place. But it was during that initial period, what was quite difficult was a lot of the suppliers were struggling to actually mobilise people at home to work, and people were struggling to get through on the phone and actually get support from their energy suppliers. So that was one of the big challenges that we saw, and that was both contact centres the energy suppliers operated in the UK, but also abroad. Some of the outsourced contact centres, maybe places where there wasn't sort of the same vaccination programs and things. They were very susceptible when there was an increase in COVID in that region. Suddenly they weren't able to answer the calls the same. So then we also started to get calls through about technical problems, things that should be quite easy for a supplier to fix if the consumer contacts them. It was quite a variety of things, but definitely the affordability and with people being at home more and having less income available than normal did drive an increase in calls during the initial few weeks of the pandemic.
You mentioned there the absence or the slow ability of the private companies, the suppliers, to be able to answer calls. Did that increase EHU's workload?
It did during those initial few weeks. We certainly saw an increase during March and early April. I think sort of reorganising sort of where priorities were at the suppliers meant that there was less immediate sort of work on sort of non-essential metering, things like that, and then they were able to answer the calls better as time went on. But there was definitely an increase in demand during that initial period, yes.
You've mentioned metering there, and you mentioned earlier in your evidence questions of prepayment meters. Were there any particular issues surrounding those during the pandemic?
I think some of the problems that could come up is where people couldn't get out to top up the meter. So again, it's that sort of, the sort of point around digital exclusion. Some people with smart meters in their property and apps can top up online, but a lot of consumers have sort of legacy meters where they need to go to a shop to purchase their credit. So where people had got COVID or COVID within the household and were having to isolate, it became a problem of how they would top up the meter. I have to say, suppliers actually were good in that situation about arranging visits, having sort of the right PPE to go into the property and add credit where necessary, or where there was other alternatives, whether it was providing a card with credit on it and posting that to the consumer, allowing friends and families to be able to pick up cards to help the consumer as well. There were a number of options that were looked at, and broadly across the suppliers, I think they did quite well in that regard.
Thank you. Just one final set of questions I'd like to explore with you in respect of client matters. obviously a number of people were still going out to work during the pandemic. We mentioned questions of guidance and the like, and in terms of some of the rules that were being applied. I wondered whether anyone was seeking advice from Citizens Advice in relation to that, health and safety matters and the like.
Yeah, it was very common. Quite often it would be somebody asking if the rules that their employers were putting in place or weren't putting in place should be there, shouldn't be there, where they've been asked to do something that was against the current regulations. It changed at so many periods over the pandemic, but it certainly was a recurring theme time and time and time again.
And are those questions that you were ready, willing and able to answer?
I would say not really any more so than members of the public. Again, I think people assumed that we had information that they didn't, which wasn't the case. And I think our advisors were having to do quite a lot of research to make sure that the information they gave to a client was as up to date as it could be, making sure that they weren't given any misinformation, things might have changed, and making sure there wasn't any detriment in place as well. That became really difficult with the speed of changes that were happening over certain periods.
You've indicated very clearly to His Lordship about the key role which Citizens Advice Bureau were providing during the pandemic in terms of an information resource. Were there any alternatives for people to seek that kind of information that you're aware of, or was Citizens Advice the default for that information?
I think there was a huge amount of organisations, but certainly in our area we were the only organisation giving that fully holistic advice on whatever topic the clients tended to come to us with.
Yeah, I mean, we are a primary provider. I think people do tend to come to us for that independent and impartial advice. As Clara said, the fact that we can provide help and support and advice on any subject means that we're a kind of go-to place for a lot of people. During the pandemic, the information was coming out fast, so we didn't necessarily have access to anything that wasn't publicly available to everybody else, but the model at Citizens Advice is primarily about having two people look at that. Then the client comes with the problem, we'll provide an advisor who can sit down and look at that information with you, try and come to a reasonable conclusion. A lot of the time people are just looking for sort of clarification on something. So, the information's coming out, perhaps you said their employer is either trying to consider whether they should be on furlough or trying to consider whether they can come back into the workplace in a safe way or work from home in a safe way. There's lots of questions there, and people would come just looking for another opinion on that, really, to try and have a look at the guidance that was around, talk about their personal circumstances. Quite often that was a three-way process then between ourselves, the client, the employee and the employer. So you'd have a conversation between the three of them about what it is the employer needs to happen, what's available to the worker and what's the worker able to do, and then what's the guidance saying about that. So it was really just about offering that negotiation, really, to try and help people come to a conclusion. The information was coming out fast, circumstances were changing all the time, so something that you decided one day may be different the next day because the pandemic was an ever-changing situation. So I think we just provided a vital point of contact for people to come to explore their options, and for us to offer just another view and another opinion on trying to interpret the information that we had at the time.
You've mentioned obviously the sort of three-way conversations with employers and others, and my original question I think was directed more towards health and safety issues, but were there any other sort of employment issues coming forward, application of furlough or anything like that?
Yeah, all of the things, whether people should be furloughed, should be in work, shouldn't be in work, the security of their employment as well, and, what normal processes then. If there were companies that were struggling and thinking they were going to go out of business, there wasn't the opportunity to have the normal kind of processes you would have in an HR situation. So it was a really worrying time for a lot of people about the security of their employment, and all of the issues, people came and spoke to us about that as well. So some of it, there was information you could give people answers for. Some of it was just providing a listening ear, because it was unknown what the conclusion might be for people. So we were just there to provide a listening ear and a kind of point of support for people. So.
Thank you. I'd like to talk to you now about the partnerships which Citizens Advice use and have. You've mentioned a number intra-bureau or inter-bureau partnerships, but you obviously deal with a number of public bodies and other organisations. I'll come on to some specific examples in a moment, but just in general, how did you feel partnership working between yourselves or public bodies worked over the pandemic?
My experience was that the third sector mobilised very quickly. So Claire's talked about the interconnections between the bureaus and about the sharing information about what we were doing and how we could continue to provide citizens' advice services to the public, but also the rest of the voluntary sector in Edinburgh sort of collaborated quickly. And what we did was we had a look at what we anticipated the needs of the community being. We looked at what our collective resources were, and we decided on ways in which we were going to try and meet that need with the resources at our disposal. We weren't siloed by what our normal way of working were. We just knew what skills and resources we had within our organisation, and decided then as chief officers that we were going to try and mobilise that resource to meet the need as it was required at that time. During a lot of that, there was no presence of the public sector. There were certainly social workers that were still having to provide services to people, but beyond that, there wasn't a lot. That you couldn't get access to the council or the local authority. There was no buildings open. There was nobody answering phone calls. So my experience was the third sector mobilised very effectively and were agile and innovative and responsive to what the needs were, and looked at their collective resources and decided how we were going to use that differently to be able to meet the needs of the public. And my experience, that was done in the absence of a proactive presence from the public sector.
Have you anything to add to that, Mrs. Christie?
I would agree. I think in Aberdeenshire, the local authority did mobilise eventually and created an Aberdeenshire COVID helpline, which was really helpful. But that was some time down the line. We'd already, there was no downtime for us. And as Benjamin said, within the third sector, there became an awful lot of close partnership working successfully to try and not overlap, to try and help as many people as possible. And I would agree, there was an absence of statutory support there, I think.
Thank you. You've mentioned local authorities and the statutory support. Can you explain to His Lordship what actual day-to-day effect that has, the absence of that has on your ability to help clients? Or maybe if I ask a slightly different question, ordinarily, would you be feeding into local authorities and in terms of referrals and other work?
In many ways, it was a lot easier.
Right.
We didn't.
Okay.
Yeah, we spend a lot of our time feeding back to funders, whether that's in the public sector or anybody else who's given us funding. And I understand that. You identify a need, you'll say how you're going to deliver on that, and you say what cost there's going to be associated to that. And somebody gives you money for that, and they quite rightly, and it's even more so in the public sector, they have a responsibility to make sure that public funds are being used effectively. So there's a lot of monitoring that goes on with that. But you spend a lot of time feeding back to people about reminding people what the need was that was identified, what service you were going to deliver, and the fact that you were delivering it, and reminding people about what was agreed about how you were going to measure the delivery of that. There's an awful lot of wasted time between the third sector and those that are funding us, particularly in the public sector. And that's because there's a lot of changes in personnel as well that take place. You're often having to re-explain to a new person who's given a responsibility to monitor that. And none of that really happened during the pandemic. So, there was, I suppose, two things. One was either there wasn't in existence, so we just had to get on with the job. But the other thing was a level of trust applied to what we were doing. And I think that that could have continued, but it hasn't continued. We've gone back to spending a significant amount of time going back to reporting on things that we're doing and spending a lot of time around that and a lot of time around negotiation of funding, which didn't really happen during the lockdown. We were just free to kind of get on with delivering the services that were needed.
Thank you. Were there any things which Citizens Advice couldn't do because the statutory services were not available?
I mean, a lot of the time we would be trying to get in contact with people about access to welfare entitlement. As we said, that was made much more easier. Other things would be, you know, a lot of the debt is debt that's owed to the public sector. It'll be council tax debt, rent arrears to social housing, and where there were moratoriums on reclaiming that, you didn't really need to get in contact with anybody to be trying to negotiate repayments of that. So, yeah, I suppose there was a lot of the things that we didn't need to get access to, but probably the biggest gap was in healthcare provision, and it was the day-to-day healthcare that people needed access to. And understandably, when you were dealing with a pandemic, understand that the NHS had to direct the majority of the resources to trying to tackle the pandemic and keep people alive, but there was a huge amount of health needs that were going unmet, and there was a massive amount of anxiety from the public about that and their inability to be able to access health services. Of course, we could still get in contact with health services, but the reality was that there were, you know, what would have been normal ongoing treatment wasn't being offered to people. So a lot of the negotiation we had with the health sector then was about trying to understand what people could do in the interim and at which point could they envisage that the treatment that they were needed was going to be able to be provided to them. But yeah, there was a huge amount of concern for people at that time, and there continues to be a huge amount of concern. I mean, we're continuing to deal with a lot of inquiries now about people who are concerned about their access to health services.
Thank you. You mentioned there, obviously, access to we've mentioned a number of times, access to the welfare and benefits information and applications. And Mrs. Christie, you mentioned specifically the DWP and the fact that you could deal with them without effectively mandates from clients. They just treated you as a representative of them. We've also talked about the move to Social Security Scotland with the devolved benefits and the like. The approach that you described in respect to the DWP, the straightforward approach, was that the same in terms of Social Security Scotland, in terms of its application?
No, not at all. From its inception, we've had serious problems becoming a third-party representative for our clients, even with implicit consent from the client. Scottish Social Security still will not deal with us, and it still remains a problem. It was a serious problem, obviously, throughout the pandemic when we had people who were transferring onto devolved benefits. It remains a problem, and it really is something that seriously needs looked at.
Thank you. One other public body, and I'm going to mention them specifically because they were mentioned specifically at the roundtable meeting, you might recall, was the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman. Were there any particular issues with that?
It just failed to exist.
Failed to exist?
For probably at least the first year. There was nothing happening, so even if we were putting cases to them, they weren't dealing with existing cases, new cases weren't being dealt with, and all that's done is create a massive backlog. But I don't know what was happening through that first year of the pandemic for them, but there was no work being done that we could see.
Thank you. That's really all the sort of specific points that I was going to raise with you this afternoon. In a moment, I'm going to give you each an opportunity if there's anything else that you would like to raise with His Lordship. One of the things which His Lordship will be reporting upon is obviously the key elements of the pandemic. We've touched upon a number of those, but if there are any other ones that you want to raise. And secondly, the other thing that we're very interested to hear is any particular lessons that you think His Lordship may wish to report upon. I will remind you, we obviously have a number of reports and documents from yourselves and indeed from Citizens Advice Scotland, but if there is anything else that you want to raise, now's your opportunity to do so. Perhaps I could start with Mr McMillan if there's anything you would like to raise.
I mean, I think that there's definitely lessons that can be learned from that time period. I think how quickly things can be done if people put their mind to it and don't get bogged down in some of the processes and things that can delay the rollout of certain programmes. I think as well it's just the need for good information to come out. That was one of the things that we dealt with during the initial days, was just a general sense of anxiety from consumers about what was happening, what their situation was going to be in the weeks ahead, so kind of getting that communication right. I think also just acknowledgement of, during lockdown, how isolated people felt. I mean, we were getting calls from consumers who we'd actually fixed their problem for them, but they were continuing to call because they were just so isolated during that time and they needed someone to speak to. And I think that's something we need to be careful about with services in local communities, that they aren't stripped away, because people do need that sort of interaction. So I guess those would be kind of the other points I would make today.
Thank you. Mrs Christie, could I come to you next?
I think I would again highlight the digital exclusion and how clear, or how much clearer it became during the pandemic. There are still so many vulnerable people and so many people that are digitally excluded for a number of reasons that just could not access the relevant services, and had it not been for the third sector, and obviously from our experience from Citizens Advice Bureau specifically, I don't know what would have happened to them. And just to highlight the ability of the third sector to support people who are digitally excluded for whatever reason, and to do it successfully and to do it in partnership with each other.
Thank you. And Mr Napier.
Yeah, final things for me. I think we've always known how vital our services are, but during the pandemic that became, it was acutely aware how much the public relied on us to be there, and the breadth of things that we can give advice on, the breadth of help and support that we can offer people. People rely on that service being there, and quite understandably we've been around communities for over 80 years, but the truth is we are not a service that is always going to exist. It needs other people to be able to fund that. We're not a money-making service, so we rely on funding to be able to be in existence. And post-pandemic, that funding is under increasing threat. A lot of the funding comes from either government or local authorities, either councils or the NHS, and they are simply running out of money. So there's less money to sustain those services. They are probably more under threat post-pandemic than they were before it. So it was recognised that we were a vital service. People relied on us to be there, but the reality is that in 2004 that's more under threat than what it has been before. So I think we need to find ways of identifying those kind of services that people did rely on, and make sure that there's some kind of stable long-term funding, so that when the public do rely on that help and support, they can have confidence that it will be there for them.
Thank you. Could I just take this opportunity to thank you very much. I've no more further questions for you this morning, unless His Lordship has anything that he wishes to ask. My Lord?
No. Thank you, Mr Turner. No, thank you. Just thank you for your attendance. That's all. Right. We'll take lunch now. Come back at 10 to 2.
Thank you, my Lord.